Before the ground cracked and the sea rose, before churches fell inward and fire swallowed what water did not, Lisbon stood as one of Europe's proudest jewels. She perched on the western edge of the continent like a queen gazing out across the Atlantic, her harbors brimming with the treasures of empire: gold from Brazil, spices from the Indies, sugar, silk, tobacco, ivory. She was the empress of Portugal's maritime glory, the city where Baroque opulence adorned both altar and avenue, where Enlightenment and piety shared boulevards, where past glories of the Age of Discovery were engraved in limestone facades and whispered through candlelit salons. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, Lisbon awoke devoutly and splendidly unaware that it was about to die. At precisely 9:40 a.m., as masses filled the churches with incense and prayer, the ground beneath Lisbon began to tremble. It started as a murmur, a deep groan from the bowels of the earth. Then, within seconds, the city convulsed with a violence that no European capital had ever recorded. Houses crumbled as if made of dust, domes cracked open, and belfries wobbled before collapsing. In a matter of minutes, the mighty became fragile, and the sacred became rubble. But it was only the beginning. As survivors fled to the riverfront, hoping the sea might offer refuge, they watched in horror as the Tagus River pulled back, exposing the muddy riverbed littered with sunken ships and forgotten debris. A roar followed, a wall of water rising from the horizon, and then Lisbon was consumed by a tsunami. Still, this biblical duality of shaking earth and devouring sea was not the final blow. Fires ignited across the city, first from toppled candles and sanctuaries, then from overturned kitchens and shattered hearths. For days, flames roared through the city's wooden bones, turning what had survived the quake and flood into ash. By the time the smoke cleared, an estimated 30,000 to 50,000 people were dead. Two-thirds of the city was destroyed. The Royal Ribera Palace, the great libraries, paintings, music scores, archives, cathedrals, gone. What unfolded in Lisbon was more than a disaster. It was a rupture in the European psyche. This was not a medieval town struck by misfortune. This was a capital of enlightenment, an empire's heart, leveled in an instant. Philosophers, scientists, theologians, and poets would struggle for decades to comprehend what it meant. In France, Voltaire would abandon optimism. In Germany, Kant would write his first works of natural science, trying to understand seismic waves. In England, sermons thundered about divine wrath and judgment, while others asked, why Lisbon and not London, not Paris? The 1755 Lisbon earthquake was not only a humanitarian catastrophe, it was a philosophical earthquake, too. It challenged the very bedrock of European thought. Was nature governed by reason or chaos? Could suffering be reconciled with a benevolent God? Were humans at the mercy of a cruel universe, or responsible for shaping it through science and order? It laid bare the fragility of civilization and the fallacy of control, shaking not just buildings, but beliefs. And yet, amid the rubble, something unprecedented emerged. Reconstruction efforts led by the Marquès de Pombal introduced modern ideas of urban planning, emergency response, and even seismic engineering. It marked one of the first times a European state responded to disaster not with superstition alone, but with statistics, logistics, and reforms. In that smoke-wreathed aftermath, Europe glimpsed the tension between faith and reason, tradition and modernity, and began to choose. To tell the story of Lisbon's earthquake is not only to document tremors and loss. It is to trace the aftershocks that rippled through salons, parliaments, universities, and churches for generations. It is to examine how a single morning can alter the course of nations, shift the compass of thought, and leave in its wake both ruin and rebirth. This is the story of a city that died in 3 waves: earthquake, tsunami, fire, and yet still reverberates in the foundations of the modern world. What was destroyed in moments would take centuries to understand. And perhaps, in some ways, we are still grappling with it. In the early decades of the 18th century, Lisbon was a city of paradoxes, at once ancient and modern, decadent and devout, proud and precariously perched on the edge of change. From the steep hills that overlooked the Atlantic, Lisbon shone like a jewel forged from conquest and faith. Her cobbled streets wound between ivory-painted facades and ornate Baroque palaces. Her plazas bustled with merchants and missionaries. Her churches echoed with sacred music, and her docks pulsed with the lifeblood of empire. For centuries, Portugal had looked westward and outward, claiming distant shores, collecting tribute, and transforming the capital into a cosmopolitan crossroads of the known world. But as November 1755 approached, the city bore more than just the weight of its own splendor. It carried the strain of contradictions left unresolved. Lisbon's wealth was visible in every direction. The azulejo tiles that adorned aristocratic villas, the grand monasteries funded by colonial gold, the chandeliers that glittered above operatic salons, the boulevards lined with stately trees and finely dressed nobility. But so too was its inequality. Beneath the grandeur of the upper town lay the tightly packed alleys of Alfama and Moraria, districts where laborers, sailors, and artisans lived in cramped quarters carved into the medieval skeleton of the city. Here, life was noisy, fragrant, dense with smoke and song. Fishmongers cried out their wares, children played beside barrels of salted cod, and carts groaned beneath sacks of grain from Brazil. Life in these quarters was lived close to the ground, humble yet vibrant. It was also where death moved swiftly when it came. The city was deeply religious, its spiritual life organized around nearly 40 churches and countless chapels. The Catholic Church wielded immense influence over public and private life. Saints were venerated as protectors of neighborhoods and professions. Holy days were both pious and performative, occasions of both reverence and revelry. Jesuits ran elite schools. Monks kept apothecaries and soup kitchens. Nuns embroidered vestments in cloisters hidden behind high walls. And as the Enlightenment quietly spread across Europe, Portugal remained devoutly tethered to Rome and the authority of tradition. The Inquisition still operated with quiet persistence. Books were censored. Heresy was whispered of, but never openly explored. Lisbon, in this way, sat in tension between past and future. Yet it was not only faith that animated Lisbon, it was trade. The city's harbors were portals to the Atlantic world, teeming with vessels bound for West Africa, Brazil, Angola, India. Ships brought sugar, coffee, gold dust, diamonds, tobacco, exotic birds, strange fruits, and enslaved people by the thousands. Slavery was embedded in Lisbon's fabric, not only in the economy, but in daily life. African slaves served in kitchens, workshops, fields, and even convents. Their labor was both invisible and ubiquitous, a quiet foundation beneath the city's glittering surface. Few spoke of them. Fewer still imagined their lives beyond utility. Over the past 50 years, Portugal had seen its fortunes rise again after a century of relative decline. The discovery of gold and diamonds in Brazil in the early 1700s had flooded the royal coffers. King João V, ruling until 1750, spent lavishly on architecture and opulence to rival the French Bourbons. His ambitions were reflected in the construction of the vast Mafra Palace, intended to mirror Versailles. But this wealth, while immense, was not deeply rooted. It flowed from colonial extraction and not domestic industry. Lisbon, rich as she appeared, was fragile, a city balanced on foreign gold and theological certainty. This fragility extended to her geography. The Tagus River curled protectively along the city's edge, but the low-lying areas near the docks were built on alluvial plains, and the tightly packed medieval core offered little resistance to natural disaster. The architecture, though beautiful, lacked structural resilience. The foundations were shallow. Walls were unreinforced. Tall buildings leaned precariously over narrow lanes. Chimneys, spires, and stone cornices loomed as deadly hazards should anything disturb their delicate balance. Despite these vulnerabilities, there was little fear. Lisbon was prosperous. Lisbon was pious. Lisbon was eternal, or so it seemed. The morning of November 1st, All Saints' Day, was anticipated like any other holy day. Shops were closed. Bells were ringing. Altars were adorned with flowers and candlelight. Families dressed in their finest and streamed into churches large and small. It was a day for confession, communion, and rest. No one imagined that the rituals of the day would turn into the dirges of a civilization. To understand the psychological impact of the coming earthquake, One must imagine not just the structures that would fall, but the worldview that stood behind them. Europe in 1755 was straddling two eras. On one hand, it clung to medieval cosmologies of divine providence, fixed hierarchy, and moral order. On the other, it had begun to embrace reason, empiricism, and natural law. Voltaire was writing satirical plays. Rousseau was musing on the origins of inequality. Newton's laws had been published. The encyclopedia had begun to circulate among intellectuals. But in Portugal, the Enlightenment had made few inroads. Lisbon remained committed to the ancient harmony between king, church, and cosmos. And so, when catastrophe arrived, it was not merely a material event, but a philosophical rupture. The earth had not just broken buildings, it had broken certainties. This chapter of Lisbon, the last before disaster, reveals the richness of what was lost. It also sets the stage for the transformation to come. For the earthquake did not merely destroy, it provoked inquiry, reform, skepticism, and ultimately, change. And that is perhaps the greatest irony. Lisbon, in falling, became a catalyst. The disaster that silenced its choirs and crushed its palaces would echo through the thoughts of Europe's greatest minds. In ash and agony, a new age would find its footing. November 1st, 1755 began not with terror, but with light. Dawn broke over Lisbon in hues of soft gold and gray, the air unusually warm for autumn. A breeze from the Tagus stirred the fabric awnings above vendor stalls in the Baixa district. The bells of the Carmo convent rang their solemn call. In the neighborhoods of Alfama and Barro Alto, priests donned vestments and lit tapers. It was All Saints' Day, one of the holiest observances in the Catholic calendar, and the devout were already kneeling in pews as the sun lifted above the tiled roofs and domed basilicas. At exactly 9:40 a.m., with thousands in mid-prayer, the earth began to tremble. At first it was subtle, a low, indistinct hum beneath the city's foundations, like the grumbling of an immense beast turning in its sleep. Then came the rolling, deep vibrations. Wood creaked, plaster cracked, dust drifted from ceiling vaults. There was a moment of disoriented silence, as if the city held its breath, and then all collapsed. The earthquake struck in three massive jolts, each one more devastating than the last. The first upheaval lasted nearly 40 seconds, a seismic convulsion that shattered walls and twisted cobblestone streets. Ancient stone churches, heavy with centuries of weight, buckled and collapsed. Arched windows imploded inward. Bell towers toppled like falling pines, sending masonry raining into the streets below. The second tremor, minutes later, tore through what was left, turning already damaged buildings into cascading ruin. Dust and screams filled the air. People who had survived the first collapse were trapped beneath beams, crushed under cornices, or entombed in stairwells that no longer led anywhere. The timing of the quake could not have been crueler. The majority of the city's population was indoors, gathered in churches for All Saints' Day Mass. These sacred spaces, sprawling, echoing structures built more for beauty than durability, became tombs. The Church of São Vicente de Fora, one of the city's largest, collapsed onto its congregation. The Carmo convent, perched atop a hill, lost its nave and walls in an instant. Even the mighty Lisbon Cathedral, which had withstood centuries of storms and wars, suffered massive structural damage. The religious faithful were crushed beneath the very stones they had worshipped beneath. In the Alfama district, built upon firmer bedrock, the damage was less complete, but panic reigned. Narrow lanes became death traps as balconies collapsed overhead and walls slid into alleys. In the richer districts near the river, the Baixa and the Chiado, the devastation was absolute. Wealthy homes, shops, customs houses, and libraries fell like children's toys kicked over in a tantrum. The Royal Ribera Palace, which had housed monarchs for generations and overlooked the Tagus, crumbled almost entirely, burying Portugal's royal archives, imperial documents, artworks, and priceless treasures. None would ever be recovered. Those who survived the initial quakes staggered into the open, their faces chalk-white with dust and disbelief. The wounded screamed. Some carried their dead. Others stood paralyzed in the streets, staring up at the shattered skyline, as if the city might somehow repair itself. Fire had not yet begun. The river had not yet changed, but already, Lisbon had ceased to be the city it had been at dawn. Many fled toward the harbor, toward what seemed the only open space, the wide stone quays along the Tagus. Crowds gathered in chaotic knots near Terreiro do Paco, hoping for safety. But what they witnessed next defied all comprehension. The river began to recede. The Tagus, once bustling with merchant ships and fishing vessels, pulled back unnaturally. The muddy riverbed was exposed, strewn with long-abandoned anchors, broken hulls, and twisted nets. A great sucking sound accompanied the retreat. Fish flopped in the mud. The crowds watched in bewildered awe. Then, far in the distance, beyond the mouth of the river and into the Atlantic, they saw it. A dark line on the horizon, growing larger, faster, louder. Within minutes, the tsunami struck. The wall of water, more than 20 feet high, raced up the Tagus and slammed into the shoreline with a force that turned stone to dust. The already ruined quays were obliterated. Ships were lifted and hurled inland like toys. Survivors who had gathered by the riverside were swept away in an instant, their cries lost beneath the roar. Barges, bridges, docks, and entire buildings were swallowed. The sea had come to finish what the earth had started. And yet, there was still worse to come. The quake had shattered ovens, overturned candles, and broken oil lamps. Fires ignited across the city, first in kitchens, then in chapels, then in homes and warehouses. With water lines broken and firefighting systems paralyzed, flames spread quickly. The Baixa district, a maze of wooden structures and flammable goods, became a furnace. The flames leapt from one building to the next, whipped by wind and fed by panic. The smoke blotted out the sun. People ran blindly through the streets, faces blistered, lungs choking. Fire claimed what neither earth nor sea had touched. By evening, Lisbon resembled a vision from the apocalypse. Columns of smoke rose in pillars as far as the eye could see. A stench of ash, blood, salt, and dust settled over the hills. Eyewitnesses described the city as hell made real. In the days to come, fires continued to burn. Corpses lay in the open. Wild dogs tore at unburied bodies. Disease followed destruction. In the chaos, looting broke out. Criminals, opportunists, and desperate survivors scavenged amid the wreckage. Some dressed themselves in aristocratic clothing pulled from the ruins. Others traded in stolen sacramental items, chalices, rosaries, golden icons torn from collapsed altars. By the time the last flames were extinguished, an estimated 30,000 to 50,000 people were dead. Some would say more. The final count was impossible. Thousands more were injured, homeless, or orphaned. The infrastructure of the Portuguese Empire had been gutted in hours. The royal family survived, but barely. King Jose I, who had been staying in Belém outside the city, would never again sleep within walls. For the rest of his life, he lived in tents, too traumatized to trust stone. The psychological impact was just as devastating. Clergy interpreted the disaster as divine punishment. Theologians debated the causes. Survivors were overwhelmed not only by grief, but by metaphysical terror. How could such ruin strike the most religious capital in Europe on a holy day? Why had churches fallen while brothels stood? Why had prayers gone unheard? These questions would echo across the continent. The Lisbon earthquake was not only a calamity of nature. It was a rupture in the human sense of order and meaning. The ground had rebelled. The sea had risen. The fire had cleansed. The world, it seemed, had forgotten its own laws. And Europe would never think the same way again. In the smoldering silence after the quake, when the screams had faded and the sky hung heavy with smoke, Lisbon lay like a corpse sprawled across a battlefield. What had once been a capital of empires, of gold and gospel, was now a scorched graveyard choked with ash and the stench of death. The sea had receded again, the flames had died, but fear remained. Disease loomed. Panic smoldered beneath every overturned stone. And yet, in that moment of paralysis, one man stood not in mourning, but in motion. That man was Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the man who would become known to history as the Marquês de Pombal. Before the earthquake, Carvalho e Melo had been a figure of ambition but not yet legend. Born into the lower ranks of the nobility, educated in law and diplomacy, he had served as Portugal's ambassador to London and Vienna. His experience abroad had sharpened his intellect, and exposed him to the winds of the Enlightenment. Ideas of rationalism, central authority, and statecraft that would soon guide his hand. At the time of the disaster, he was Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and War, a high but not absolute position in King José's court. But in the hours following the destruction of Lisbon, when the monarchy and the clergy were paralyzed by indecision and grief, Carvalho e Melo took command. His first order was clear, concise, and unwavering: bury the dead and feed the living. It was not philosophy, it was not prayer, it was action, and it marked the beginning of a new form of governance in Portugal, one rooted not in divine interpretation, but in pragmatic control. The Marquês de Pombal understood that Lisbon could not be rebuilt if chaos reigned. Looters were executed without trial. Priests who preached that the destruction was God's punishment and therefore not to be resisted were silenced or replaced. Public order was enforced by soldiers and engineers. For the first time, a European government responded to natural disaster not only with spiritual consolation, but with logistics, discipline, and data. The scope of Pombal's challenge was nearly incomprehensible. Tens of thousands of survivors were homeless. Food supplies were destroyed. The city's granaries, markets, and mills had been annihilated. Disease threatened to break out in the makeshift camps forming on Lisbon's periphery. Hundreds of bodies lay rotting in the streets. Pombal ordered mass cremations and organized public kitchens. Grain was requisitioned from across the country. Medical care was rationed with military precision. But it was not enough to survive. Lisbon had to be reborn. Within days, Pombal summoned a group of military engineers and architects to begin the planning of a new Lisbon, a city that would not only replace what had been lost, but reflect the future of rationalist Europe. He rejected calls to rebuild the medieval labyrinth that had existed before. The Baixa, the downtown core, would be razed entirely and redesigned from the ground up. Streets would be widened, squares expanded. A strict grid plan would replace the tangled alleys. Buildings would be uniform in design, height, and facade, a revolutionary concept at the time. And most importantly, the new buildings would be constructed using methods that accounted for the possibility of future quakes. The engineers, under Pombal's direction, developed what would become known as the Pombaline cage, a wooden lattice framework built inside masonry walls that could absorb and flex with seismic motion. To test its effectiveness, models were built and soldiers were ordered to march around them to simulate tremors. It was one of the earliest recorded examples of seismic engineering in Europe. The architecture that emerged was functional but elegant, sober but forward-looking, a physical embodiment of Enlightenment values in stone and wood. This rebuilding effort was unprecedented. It would take decades, cost a fortune, and forever alter Lisbon's character. But Pombal was relentless. He centralized authority, cutting through the slow bureaucracy of noble families and church officials who had dominated Lisbon's urban development for centuries. He used the disaster to consolidate power, bypassing traditional institutions and elevating technocrats and scientists into roles of influence. The Enlightenment in Portugal, once tepid and cautious, was now rising amid the ruins. But Pombal's revolution was not merely architectural or administrative. It was ideological. He used the earthquake as a justification to challenge the power of the Jesuits, whom he saw as obstacles to progress and royal authority. In the years following the disaster, he accused them of fomenting sedition, manipulating the monarchy, and hoarding wealth. Their influence over education, trade, and foreign missions was systematically dismantled. Eventually, Pombal succeeded in expelling the Jesuits from Portugal and its colonies, a move that shocked Catholic Europe and signaled a profound shift in the balance between faith and reason in the Portuguese state. Meanwhile, the monarchy, shaken by the disaster and grateful for Pombal's effectiveness, gave him near-total control. He was ennobled as the Marquês de Pombal and ruled Portugal as its de facto prime minister. His reforms extended to tax policy, colonial administration, industry, and education. He introduced public health programs, state-sponsored schools, and economic regulations aimed at reducing dependency on British imports. In every corner of Portuguese life, the earthquake's aftershocks were felt in the reforms that followed. But not all applauded his methods. Pombal's regime, though visionary, was authoritarian. He ruled with a heavy hand, silencing critics, exiling political opponents, and imprisoning nobles who opposed his changes. In 1758, after a failed assassination attempt on King Jose I, Pombal accused the powerful Tavora family and had them publicly executed. The spectacle was brutal: carriages destroyed, heads mounted on spikes, noblemen stripped of titles. It sent a message: the old order was dead, and a new Portugal had risen in its place. Pombal's Lisbon was, in many ways, a city of imposed clarity. The winding, mystical city of saints and secrets had been replaced by a rationalist capital of order, symmetry, and control. The Baixa was reconstructed with broad avenues and neoclassical facades. Street names commemorated Enlightenment ideals. Commerce resumed. The empire staggered forward, and the scars of the disaster were gradually hidden beneath new stone. Yet the trauma of 1755 never truly faded. Beneath the rebuilt facades and measured streets, memory lingered. The people of Lisbon had lived through an apocalypse. They had seen the world end and begin again. And for all of Pombal's brilliance and brutality, he could not erase the memory of that morning when the earth turned on its inhabitants. What he did create, however, was a blueprint, not only for Lisbon's survival, but for how modern states might face catastrophe. In the ruins, he saw opportunity. In the firelight, he saw the glimmer of a future ruled not by superstition, but by science and law. And though history would later judge him with ambivalence, there can be no doubt that in 1755, it was Sebastio José de Carvalho y Melo, the Marqués de Pombal, who stood between a fallen city and oblivion. News of Lisbon's destruction did not travel quietly. Like the quake itself, it rippled outward in all directions, across hills, oceans, borders, and mines. In the weeks following November 1st, 1755, ships sailed from the smoldering coast of Portugal to ports in Britain, France, the Netherlands, and beyond, their hulls heavy with the dust of catastrophe and their crews bearing tales of unspeakable horror. The narrative spread swiftly through letters, newspapers, and diplomatic channels. A thriving imperial capital had been devoured by the earth, drowned by the sea, and scorched by fire, all in the span of a single day. The continent trembled, not with tremors of stone, but of conscience. It was not simply the scale of destruction that so startled Europe. Cities had burned before. Plagues had ravaged kingdoms. Even earthquakes had shaken villages. But Lisbon was different. It was no remote outpost or forgotten hamlet. Lisbon was one of the major capitals of the Christian world, the seat of a global empire, a bastion of Catholic piety, and a center of Enlightenment commerce. It had been struck not during some heathen festival or military rebellion, but on All Saints' Day, while its population was engaged in Mass. The symbolism was too stark to ignore. Theologians, priests, philosophers, poets, and pamphleteers each rushed to make sense of it. In pulpits across Europe, clerics warned of divine wrath. God, they proclaimed, had punished Lisbon for its sins, for arrogance, for pride, for the sins of empire, or even, some whispered, for tolerating heretics. Jesuit preachers in particular saw in the destruction a moral reckoning. It is God who speaks, thundered one French sermon, and Lisbon is his mouthpiece. Yet this explanation, once so comfortably embraced in past disasters, now met resistance. Europe in 1755 was no longer a medieval world ruled solely by faith. It was a continent increasingly shaped by science, reason, and the burgeoning Enlightenment. Natural philosophers, as scientists were then called, began asking not why Lisbon had been destroyed, but how. What forces beneath the earth could cause such devastation? What mechanisms governed the shaking of continents, the movement of seas, the chemistry of fire? The Lisbon earthquake marked one of the earliest moments when a natural disaster became a scientific inquiry. In London, the Royal Society convened to discuss seismic activity. Reports were solicited. Geologic theories were proposed. In France and Germany, proto-seismologists sketched fault lines and recorded the aftershocks that had reached as far as the Alps and the British Isles. The idea that the earth could behave according to natural laws, independent of divine will, began to take root more deeply than ever before. But the impact of Lisbon was not limited to the physical sciences. It shook the intellectual and moral foundations of Europe itself. Few thinkers were more deeply affected than Voltaire. At the time of the quake, Voltaire was living in relative seclusion near Geneva, embroiled in his usual battles with religious hypocrisy and state censorship. When news of Lisbon reached him, he was horrified, not only by the loss of life, but by the wave of theological justifications that followed. The idea that such suffering had been meted out by a benevolent deity struck him as monstrous. In his poetic masterpiece, Poems sur le désastre de Lisbonne, he unleashed a scathing critique. Will you say, in seeing this heap of victims, that God is avenged, their death is the price of their crimes? Voltaire's poem challenged the centuries-old belief in a just and all-powerful God whose will was reflected in earthly events. If Lisbon's destruction was divine punishment, he asked, why were innocent children buried alive beneath churches? Why did brothels remain standing while monasteries fell? Why did the wicked escape while the virtuous were crushed? These questions were not rhetorical, they were indictments. Voltaire's response to Lisbon would later culminate in one of his most famous works, Candide. In it, he satirized the optimistic philosophy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, particularly the idea, promoted by some Enlightenment thinkers, that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Through the character of Pangloss, who insists even amid horror that all is for the best, Voltaire exposed the absurdity of blind optimism in the face of overwhelming suffering. Lisbon became his evidence that human cruelty and natural catastrophe could not be wrapped in comforting illusions. But Voltaire was not alone in grappling with Lisbon's implications. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his philosophical rival, offered a different critique, not of theology, but of society. In a letter responding to Voltaire's poem, Rousseau argued that it was not nature but civilization that had magnified the disaster. Had people lived in smaller homes, built farther apart and closer to nature, the destruction might not have been so catastrophic. It was urban density, he implied, that killed so many, not the earth itself. This divergence between Voltaire and Rousseau, between cosmic injustice and societal culpability, reflected the broader philosophical debates of the Enlightenment. Lisbon forced Europeans to confront not only the fragility of their cities, but the fragility of their beliefs. Was suffering the result of sin, design, or chance? Was progress a shield against disaster, or its cause? Could reason protect against ruin, or did it merely expose the depth of human vulnerability? Beyond philosophy, Lisbon altered how governments and populations understood disaster itself. The response of the Portuguese state, led by the Marquês de Pombal, was widely discussed and admired. His swift imposition of order, commitment to scientific rebuilding, and rejection of fatalism provided a model for secular disaster management that would influence Europe for generations. In Britain, newspapers reported on his reforms with awe. In France, urban planners began rethinking city design. The idea that catastrophe required not prayer, but planning took hold. Lisbon also inspired one of the earliest examples of international humanitarian aid. Across Europe, donations were collected for survivors. The King of Spain sent money. The Pope offered indulgences and financial assistance. Even Protestant nations like England and the Netherlands, normally at odds with Catholic Portugal, sent ships filled with food, medicine, and supplies. The quake had shattered boundaries not only of stone, but of politics. And in the arts, too, Lisbon left its mark. Painters depicted the destruction in apocalyptic landscapes, some realistic, others visionary. Composers wrote elegies. Playwrights set tragedies amid the ruins. In an age obsessed with reason and symmetry, the earthquake reminded artists that chaos was still part of the human experience. Even in distant corners of the world, the shock was felt. In the American colonies, ministers debated whether Lisbon was a sign of the end times. Benjamin Franklin reportedly studied accounts of the disaster in his own investigations into electricity and energy. The world was growing smaller, and Lisbon's fall showed that a single event could ripple through the fabric of global thought. What Lisbon proved, unequivocally, was that natural disasters were not merely local events. They were philosophical earthquakes, tremors that cracked open the foundation of belief and demanded new explanations. The ground had moved beneath Lisbon, but its aftershocks moved through the minds of men from Paris to Berlin, from London to Philadelphia. Europe could no longer look at the world with the same eyes. The collapse of Lisbon was not merely physical. It was theological. It was doctrinal. It was spiritual. For centuries, Europe had lived within a cosmology that placed divine providence at the center of all worldly events. Storms were sent by God. Plagues were punishments. Victories were blessings. Cathedrals reached upward as proof of faith's architecture, tangible stone affirmations that God was present and benevolent. But when the earth opened on All Saints' Day and swallowed thousands of the devout inside churches they thought were sanctuaries, the question was no longer whether Lisbon's buildings had failed. The question was whether God had. To stand in the ruins of Lisbon was to feel abandoned by heaven. The shattered domes of churches, the melted altars, the collapsed cloisters, all symbols of salvation, now resembled tombs. The cataclysm had struck while congregations were kneeling. Entire parishes died as they prayed. In the church of São Vicente de Fora, worshippers were crushed beneath falling vaults. In the Carmo convent, the roof caved in on its friars. The Cathedral of Lisbon, its great bell silent, stood as a skeleton of its former grandeur. If these houses of God could be leveled so swiftly, then what did that say about the strength of their foundations, material or metaphysical? Theologians scrambled to respond. Some, particularly among the Jesuits, doubled down. They spoke of Lisbon's decadence, its corruption, its sinful pride. God, they said, had offered a warning. The catastrophe was divine justice, a purgative fire for an impure land. Their sermons were filled with references to Sodom and Gomorrah, to the flood, to Job. Lisbon had been arrogant, too entangled in gold and empire, too tolerant of moral decay. The faithful, they argued, were being tested. But the innocent who perished? They were martyrs, their deaths mysterious but part of a grander providential design. Yet for many in the clergy and the laity alike, these explanations rang hollow. Worse, they felt cruel. Was it truly justice to annihilate children in prayer? To bury nuns alive beneath collapsing cloisters? Was God a judge, or merely indifferent? These doubts spread like an infection. In confessionals and parlors, in taverns and universities, people began to speak hesitantly, then openly. What if the quake meant nothing? Or worse, what if it meant that heaven was silent? This was the moment when faith met reason at a fault line. The Enlightenment had already been planting seeds of doubt, advocating for inquiry over obedience, skepticism over dogma. But Lisbon provided the rupture. Voltaire's poem had struck a nerve not only among intellectuals, but among ordinary readers. In village churches and city salons, people read his verses aloud, not always in agreement, but always in astonishment. Here was a man who dared to suggest that not all suffering was meaningful, that perhaps no cosmic balance sheet tallied the dead, that a falling boulder was a falling boulder, not a heavenly decree. Voltaire's anger was not atheistic, it was moral. He could not reconcile the concept of a loving God with the image of thousands of believers entombed beneath sanctified ceilings. Others followed him in this inquiry, not as rebels, but as mourners. The Lisbon disaster became, in a profound sense, the first modern crisis of faith played out in the public sphere. In the years that followed, theological writings across Europe shifted in tone. Some theologians embraced what would become known as natural theology, the idea that God's will could be read not through Scripture alone, but through the study of nature and reason. They sought to reconcile belief with science, interpreting natural disasters as part of a lawful universe rather than arbitrary wrath. This offered some comfort, but also a dangerous freedom. If the earthquake followed natural law, then where was God in it? No longer the active hand behind each tremor, he became a distant architect, perhaps too distant. Other thinkers moved further. They began to argue that morality could exist independently of divine command, that ethics did not require a punishing deity to be valid. Lisbon had shown that bad things could happen to good people, and that the universe might operate with indifference. This opened the door to secular humanism, to the idea that compassion, justice, and responsibility could be grounded not in Scripture, but in shared human experience. The ground had shifted not only beneath Lisbon, but beneath the moral architecture of Europe. For the Catholic Church, this moment was perilous. The quake had struck the heart of one of its most loyal kingdoms. Portugal was a bastion of Catholic identity, with deep ties to Rome, to the Jesuit order, to the missionary movements that fanned out across the globe. If doubt could take root there, it could grow anywhere. The Vatican issued letters of condolence and reaffirmation. Masses were held for the dead. Indulgences were offered. But none of this erased the images of broken crucifixes, of bloodied saints' statues lying face down in ash. Protestant Europe, meanwhile, seized upon Lisbon with theological glee. Many Anglican and Lutheran ministers interpreted the disaster as a sign of Catholic corruption. They pointed to the collapsed churches and claimed it was God's judgment on idolatry, on papist excess, on the perceived heresies of Rome. In England, sermons warned that similar punishments might await those who clung to superstition rather than scripture. But beneath this opportunism lay fear. If God had punished Lisbon, why had he spared London? Could divine fire not fall upon any city, regardless of creed? These questions led not to triumphalism, but to introspection. Across the confessional divides, Europeans realized that no theology could neatly contain Lisbon. The disaster had happened to people of all faiths and none. It had spared the wicked and killed the pious. It had ignored national borders and religious boundaries. In this, it was a great equalizer, reminding a divided continent of its shared mortality. Artists captured this with unflinching power. Religious paintings of the quake did not show heavenly salvation, but apocalyptic chaos. One especially famous engraving depicted the city as a twisted battlefield, with churches crumbling and the sky split in divine fury. Another, more subdued, showed a lone priest administering last rites to a dying woman in a collapsed chapel, God silent, the priest human. And yet, in this silence, something remarkable began to grow. In the absence of divine explanation, human solidarity emerged. Across Portugal, people helped each other rebuild not out of fear of hell, but out of love, out of necessity. Acts of kindness were not always born of piety, but of shared grief. The quake did not end faith, but it transformed it, from a cosmic contract into a personal, internal compass. The God who once ruled through fire and flood now seemed to retreat, leaving space for human hands to do the work of redemption. For some, this was terrifying. For others, liberating. It marked the beginning of a shift toward moral autonomy. The belief that humans could and must choose right from wrong without waiting for divine endorsement. Lisbon did not disprove God. It simply made the question less central. Life, death, justice, charity, these were no longer dictated solely from the pulpit. They were found in the rubble, in the choices people made as they stood among ruins. In this way, the faith that survived Lisbon was not doctrinal. It was experiential. It was not about creeds or catechisms, but about resilience, compassion, and the search for meaning in the face of silence. Lisbon taught Europe that belief, to endure, must bend. That theologies must face not only scripture, but also the ground beneath them. And that perhaps the most enduring faith was the one that remained, quietly, amid the ashes. In the 18th century, Europe's worldview was still deeply anchored in the conviction that the universe was governed by divine order and providence. Disasters, whether famine, plague, or fire, were often explained as acts of God, either punishments for collective sin or mysterious trials designed to test the faithful. But the sheer scale and cruelty of the Lisbon earthquake in 1755 ruptured this theological framework in a way no earlier calamity had managed. On a day sacred to the Catholic Church, while candles burned on altars and prayers rose from thousands of voices, the earth convulsed, killing the devout and the irreligious alike. To witness pious families crushed beneath church domes, while some notorious sinners stumbled out of brothels to find themselves alive, was to confront a brutal contradiction. For many, this was not merely a physical catastrophe, but a spiritual crisis. The Catholic hierarchy in Portugal initially responded as tradition dictated, calling for days of penance, processions, and public acts of contrition. Preachers thundered from temporary pulpits and makeshift chapels that the quake was divine judgment on Lisbon's sins, its pride, its wealth, its moral laxity, and perhaps even its involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. Yet such explanations rang hollow for many survivors. The randomness of the destruction seemed incompatible with the idea of a just and merciful God who intervened directly in human affairs. Why, people asked, had children perished in collapsing orphanages? Why had the righteous suffered alongside the corrupt? These questions, whispered in the streets and shouted in taverns, marked the beginning of a broader intellectual reckoning. The theological impact of Lisbon's destruction was amplified by the city's prominence in the Catholic world. Lisbon was not a peripheral town. It was a wealthy imperial capital, a hub of global trade, and a center of missionary activity stretching from Brazil to India and beyond. That such a city could be devastated in an instant struck at the heart of the idea that divine favor followed the Catholic powers of Europe. Even in Rome, the disaster provoked unease. In Madrid and Paris, it stirred debates in court salons and ecclesiastical councils. Across the continent, the earthquake became a touchstone for the Enlightenment's emerging critique of traditional theodicy, the attempt to reconcile the existence of evil and suffering with an omnipotent, benevolent God. The French philosopher Voltaire, already skeptical of easy optimism, seized upon Lisbon as the ultimate rebuttal to the comforting but fragile worldview popularized by thinkers like Leibniz. In his poem Sur le désastre de Lisbonne, poem on the Lisbon disaster, published in 1756, Voltaire ridiculed the idea that such a tragedy could be part of some greater harmony or best of all possible worlds. To him, the sight of tens of thousands crushed, burned, or drowned could not be squared with a vision of divine providence that treated human suffering as somehow necessary for the cosmic good. Voltaire's outrage was sharpened by the hypocrisy he perceived in theological explanations. He pointed out that if Lisbon's destruction was punishment for sin, then why had the same day passed without calamity in equally corrupt or more morally decadent cities? And why had Lisbon's most devout citizens, those in church for All Saints' Day Mass, been among the first to perish when roofs and towers collapsed upon them? Such questions were not new, but the disaster's visibility in an increasingly interconnected Europe, aided by the rapid spread of printed accounts, made them unavoidable. Other thinkers took different approaches. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing in response to Voltaire, argued that the scale of the disaster was worsened not by divine will but by human choices. He speculated that if Lisbon had been built with lighter materials, on less densely packed streets, and with greater respect for natural geography, fewer lives would have been lost. Rousseau's view shifted the blame subtly but profoundly from God to humanity. In this framing, earthquakes were natural events. It was human hubris, ignorance, and poor planning that turned them into mass tragedies. Within the Catholic Church itself, the disaster provoked both defensive retrenchment and theological innovation. Some clerics doubled down on traditional interpretations, framing the event as a call to repentance and a warning against the secularizing tendencies of Enlightenment thought. Others, however, recognized the inadequacy of simplistic moral narratives. Jesuit scholars, in particular, began to explore more naturalistic explanations of the quake, drawing on emerging geological observations. They proposed that earthquakes might be the result of subterranean forces, shifting rocks, expanding gases, rather than direct divine intervention. While these ideas did not yet amount to a full scientific theory of seismology, they reflected a willingness to accommodate new knowledge within a theological framework. The theological shockwaves of Lisbon were not confined to Europe. In the colonies of the Portuguese Empire, priests and missionaries wrestled with how to present the disaster to indigenous and enslaved populations. In Brazil, where news of the quake arrived weeks later, sermons oscillated between urging prayer for Lisbon and portraying the event as a reminder of God's power over all nations. In Goa, Catholic clergy debated whether the disaster should be interpreted as punishment for Lisbon's mistreatment of non-European subjects. An interpretation that, though radical, reflected the increasingly global reach of theological discourse. One of the most enduring consequences of the Lisbon earthquake was its role in accelerating a shift from providential explanations of disasters towards secular, empirical ones. This was not an overnight transformation. Faith remained central to the lives of most Europeans, but Lisbon planted seeds of doubt that would grow over the following century. The sight of a capital destroyed so arbitrarily encouraged more people to seek causes in natural processes rather than divine will. This shift dovetailed with the broader Enlightenment project, the belief that through observation, reason, and science, humanity could understand and perhaps mitigate the forces of nature. It is telling that alongside theological treatises and sermons, the months after the quake saw an explosion of pamphlets, essays, and letters proposing practical measures to prevent or lessen the effects of future disasters. These range from architectural reforms to early warning systems based on animal behavior or changes in water levels. Though many were speculative or unworkable, the very act of proposing them reflected a change in mindset, the conviction that human agency mattered, that people were not merely passive recipients of divine fate. Still, the spiritual wound inflicted by the earthquake was deep. For some, it prompted a crisis of faith from which they never recovered. Diaries and letters from the period reveal individuals who abandoned religious practice altogether, unable to reconcile what they had witnessed with the doctrines they had once embraced. Others experienced a more personal reformation, shifting toward a quieter, more private spirituality that placed less emphasis on institutional authority and more on individual conscience. This diversity of responses underscores the complexity of Lisbon's theological legacy. It did not destroy religion in Europe, far from it. But it altered the conversation in ways that could not be undone. In universities, in salons, in pulpits, and in coffee houses, the question of how to understand the earthquake became a proxy for the larger debate about the relationship between God, nature, and humanity. By the end of the decade, the memory of the disaster had been woven into the intellectual fabric of the Enlightenment. The Lisbon earthquake stood as both a cautionary tale and a rallying point, a reminder of nature's indifference to human suffering, but also a spur to deepen understanding and prepare for the future. In this way, it became not just a Portuguese tragedy, but a European, and indeed a global, event in the history of ideas. Lisbon had been shaken to its core, but so too had the philosophical and theological certainties of the age. And though the city's stones would be set anew in ordered streets and resilient walls, the questions it raised about divine justice, human responsibility, and the nature of suffering would echo far beyond its rebuilt squares, reverberating through centuries of thought to come. When the dust began to settle over Lisbon, the city was hardly recognizable to those who had once called it home. Landmarks that had defined the skyline for centuries were gone, cathedrals reduced to stumps of masonry, palaces nothing more than smoldering heaps, entire neighborhoods obliterated. The November air carried the mingled scents of burnt wood, charred flesh, and wet earth, and the ground still trembled occasionally with aftershocks, as if the earth was unwilling to let the memory of its violence fade too quickly. For the survivors, there was no returning to normal. There was only the slow, uncertain task of creating something new from the ruins. At the center of this colossal challenge stood Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the Marquis of Pombal. He had already distinguished himself by acting decisively in the disaster's immediate aftermath, organizing rescue efforts, preventing the spread of disease, and ordering mass burials. But Pombal's most enduring contribution would come in the months and years that followed, when he spearheaded the complete redesign and reconstruction of Lisbon. His approach was revolutionary for the time, combining Enlightenment ideals with pragmatic governance to create a city that was not merely restored, but reimagined for a safer future. The first step was to impose order on chaos. Pombal gathered engineers, architects, and military officers, forming a multidisciplinary team whose expertise would be the backbone of the reconstruction. This alone was radical. Cities in the 18th century were rarely rebuilt according to unified plans. They grew haphazardly, shaped by accidents of geography, commerce, and history. But Pombal saw the destruction as an opportunity to impose rationality upon Lisbon's medieval sprawl. The old city's layout had been a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets, many no more than alleyways, designed long before fire safety or traffic flow were considerations. In the quake's aftermath, these medieval remnants had become death traps. Flames had spread rapidly, and collapsed buildings had blocked evacuation routes. The new plan would sweep much of this away. Streets were to be widened, straightened, and arranged in a grid pattern, facilitating movement, reducing fire hazards, and creating a sense of openness. This was not only a matter of safety, it was a declaration that the rebuilt Lisbon would be a modern capital, embodying the clarity and rationality of Enlightenment thought. One of the most forward-thinking elements of the reconstruction was the introduction of seismic-resistant architecture. Pombal's engineers developed a wooden lattice framework, known as the Gaiola Pombalina, Pombaline cage, to be embedded within the walls of new buildings. This internal skeleton distributed seismic forces more evenly, allowing structures to sway without collapsing. In an era when most of Europe built almost entirely from stone and mortar, the Gaiola system was a groundbreaking innovation, an early form of earthquake engineering born from direct observation of what had failed in 1755. To test the new designs, Pombal reportedly ordered that scale models of buildings be assembled and subjected to simulated tremors. Lacking modern shake tables, soldiers were marched in unison around the models to generate vibrations, an ingenious, if rudimentary experiment. Whether this story is entirely factual or partly apocryphal is uncertain. Some historians suspect it may be a later embellishment, but it reflects the spirit of empirical testing that defined the reconstruction. The Baixa district, the commercial heart of Lisbon, became the flagship of the new city. Its wide boulevards, uniform building facades, and symmetrical plazas were designed not only for practical resilience, but also for aesthetic harmony. The Praça do Comércio, a grand waterfront square, was conceived as both a symbolic and functional centerpiece, an open space that could serve as a gathering place in daily life and a refuge in times of crisis. From here, a network of streets extended inland in precise lines, each regulated for height, facade design, and materials. This strict uniformity was not mere vanity. It was a deliberate attempt to prevent fire from leaping unpredictably between mismatched rooftops and to ensure that future rebuilding could proceed quickly if needed. Reconstruction also involved a deep rethinking of social order. Before the quake, Lisbon had been a city of sharp contrasts, palaces and convents towering over crowded slums, with little planning to integrate the lives of the rich and poor. Pombal's new Lisbon was more egalitarian in physical form, if not entirely in spirit. By standardizing building dimensions and facades, he erased some of the most visible distinctions between classes in the urban landscape. While the wealthy could still decorate interiors lavishly, the city's public face became one of uniform dignity, reflecting the Enlightenment belief in a common civic identity. Yet the transformation of Lisbon was not without controversy. The sweeping demolition of what little had survived the quake meant the erasure of centuries of architectural heritage. Some residents mourned the loss of historic streets and churches, which, had they been preserved, might have stood as tangible links to the city's medieval past. Pombal, however, was unmoved by such sentimentality. To him, clinging to the past was a luxury Lisbon could not afford. His vision was of a capital that looked forward, not backward, a city that embodied Portugal's resilience and modernity in the face of catastrophe. Financing the reconstruction posed another formidable challenge. The quake had devastated not only Lisbon's buildings, but also its economy. Warehouses full of goods from Brazil, Africa, and India had burned. The port was in ruins, and many of the city's merchants had perished. Pombal responded with a mixture of fiscal reforms and authoritarian measures. He imposed new taxes, secured foreign loans, and even requisitioned resources directly from the church, whose wealth in Portugal was immense. Monasteries and convents were dissolved or repurposed, their lands sold to fund the rebuilding. This redistribution of resources further fueled tensions between Pombal and the Jesuits, whose influence he would later move to crush entirely. For the labor force, Pombal enacted strict regulations. Skilled craftsmen were brought in from across the country, while unskilled laborers, including prisoners, were conscripted for heavy work. Wages were controlled, and idleness was punished. This quasi-military approach ensured rapid progress, but bred resentment among those who felt exploited. Pombal, however, saw such measures as necessary discipline. In his eyes, the urgency of the task left no room for the slower rhythms of traditional guild work. By the early 1760s, significant portions of the Baixa were complete, and Lisbon's transformation was becoming apparent to both residents and foreign visitors. Travelers from other European capitals remarked on the city's modern appearance, its orderly streets, and the sense of spaciousness uncommon in urban centers of the time. The rebuilt Lisbon was cleaner, safer, and in many respects more functional than its predecessor. It was also a political statement. Pomble's Lisbon was a manifestation of enlightened absolutism, where centralized authority and rational planning combined to impose order on both society and space. The reconstruction had ripple effects beyond Portugal's borders. Architects and urban planners from other earthquake-prone regions studied the Pombaline system, and the idea of designing cities with disaster resilience in mind began to circulate more widely. While it would take many decades for such principles to be adopted broadly, Lisbon's example planted a seed. The city became a case study in how catastrophe could serve as a catalyst for modernization, not merely replacing what was lost, but using destruction as an opportunity to build something stronger and more rational. Yet for all its success, the rebuilt Lisbon was also a monument to the power and will of one man. The Marquis of Pombal's imprint on the city was total, and while his reforms brought undeniable benefits, they also reflected the autocratic nature of his rule. Critics accused him of using the disaster as a pretext to centralize power, crush political opponents, and reshape society according to his own ideals. Supporters countered that without his decisive leadership, Lisbon might have languished for decades in ruin. Both views contained truth. By the time Pombal fell from power in 1777, Lisbon had been largely restored. The scars of the earthquake remained. In memories, in the absence of lost landmarks, and in the ever-present awareness that the earth could betray its inhabitants without warning, but the city had been remade into something unprecedented in Europe, a planned, modern capital born directly from catastrophe. Lisbon's reconstruction was more than an act of engineering. It was a philosophical statement. It proclaimed that human beings, armed with reason, discipline, and determination, could stand against nature's fury, not by defying it, but by adapting to it. The orderly streets, the resilient buildings, the open squares, all were part of a living argument that the Enlightenment's faith in progress was not mere rhetoric but a practical creed, one that could be inscribed in stone, timber, and public space. And so, from the ashes and rubble of November 1st, 1755, Lisbon rose again, not as it had been, but as it could be. Its new face was both a memorial to what had been lost and a promise to the generations that followed. That destruction need not mean defeat, and that even in the shadow of the greatest calamity, a city, like the people who inhabit it, can choose to rise stronger than before. In the immediate aftermath of the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, as smoke still coiled upward from the ruined city and the cries of the injured echoed through its streets, one man's mind was already turning toward a question that few in his generation would have considered urgent. How can we understand this? The Marquis of Pombal, a statesman of ruthless pragmatism and unyielding vision, had no patience for endless theological speculation about divine wrath. His task was to rebuild Lisbon, and to rebuild it intelligently. But Pombal also understood that rebuilding without knowledge was only preparing for the next disaster. And so, in one of the most forward-thinking acts of governance of the 18th century, he launched what may be considered the first systematic scientific survey of an earthquake. The method was deceptively simple but unprecedented for its time. Detailed questionnaires were dispatched to every parish in Portugal and even into parts of Spain, seeking eyewitness accounts. These were not vague pleas for stories. They were structured inquiries, designed to elicit measurable, comparable data. Questions included: did the water in wells rise or fall? How many minutes did the shaking last? Did animals behave strangely before the event? Which direction did church bells swing during the tremors? Were there aftershocks, and if so, how many? The precision of these queries revealed a mind intent on more than rebuilding. It sought to decode the very mechanics of the earth. This data-gathering exercise represented a turning point in European attitudes toward natural disasters. For centuries, earthquakes had been interpreted primarily through the lens of theology or folklore. They were the punishment of gods, the work of subterranean demons, or the expression of divine anger towards sinful cities. While Pombal himself did not deny the possibility of divine will, he insisted on supplementing such interpretations with hard evidence. By framing the earthquake as a natural event that could be studied, he pushed Portugal, and by extension, Europe, closer to a scientific understanding of the planet's behavior. The responses to Pombal's questionnaires painted a complex and often contradictory picture. In some coastal towns, the sea withdrew so far that the seabed was exposed before rushing back as a towering wave. In others, no such phenomenon was observed. Some parishes reported livestock panicking hours before the quake, while others saw no unusual animal behavior. The shaking had been stronger in some inland regions than in certain coastal areas, confounding assumptions that proximity to the epicenter alone determined intensity. Without realizing it, these 18th century correspondents were providing the raw data that modern seismologists would later use to understand concepts like wave propagation, soil liquefaction, and local geological amplification. Of course, Europe in 1755 lacked the theoretical framework to make sense of all these observations. The science of geology was still in its infancy. The very idea that the surface of the Earth might be shaped by slow-moving but constant natural forces, rather than by singular catastrophic events or divine fiat, was only beginning to take root. Figures like Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, were challenging biblical chronologies, suggesting that the Earth was far older than the 6,000 years implied by Scripture. In this intellectual climate, the Lisbon earthquake became a test case for natural philosophy, the term then used for science, inviting speculation about subterranean vapors, volcanic chains, and the balance of the planet's internal fluids. Some thinkers, like the English natural philosopher John Michel, attempted to construct mechanical explanations for earthquakes. Michel suggested that seismic shocks were waves caused by the sudden shifting of subterranean strata, an insight strikingly close to the modern theory of fault rupture. Though lacking the tools to confirm his ideas, Michel was part of a small but growing circle of minds who believed that understanding earthquakes required observation, measurement, and theory, not merely scripture and prayer. In Catholic universities, the shift toward empirical investigation was more cautious. Jesuit scholars in Portugal and Spain collected observations, but often framed their conclusions within theological language, presenting earthquakes as both natural and providential. Yet, even here, the emphasis on collecting first-hand accounts indicated a subtle transformation. The Lisbon catastrophe had forced a recognition that divine intent, whether believed in or not, did not preclude natural mechanisms. God might be the author, but nature was his instrument, and instruments could be studied. One of the most remarkable aspects of Pombal's survey is how modern its impulse feels. Today, after any major earthquake, seismologists fan out to record ground motion, damage patterns, and eyewitness narratives. In 1755, this was unheard of. Pombal's insistence on structured data collection prefigured not only earthquake science, but also disaster forensics in general. His work demonstrated that catastrophes could be dissected and learned from, rather than simply endured and mourned. The Lisbon survey also intersected with another Enlightenment trend, the growing fascination with global interconnectedness. By the mid-18th century, the European colonial empires had knitted the world into a web of trade, politics, and information. The Lisbon earthquake, occurring in a major imperial capital, became one of the first truly global news events. Reports arrived from Brazil, where the tremors had been faintly felt, and from the Azores, where aftershocks rattled the islands. Merchants in London and Amsterdam discussed the disaster not only in terms of human loss, but also its impact on commerce, particularly in gold shipments from Brazil to Portugal. This global scope encouraged comparative thinking. Scholars began to ask, were earthquakes in Peru or Japan similar to Lisbon's? Could they be caused by the same subterranean processes? Such questions were rudimentary, but marked the beginnings of a comparative seismology, an acknowledgement that nature's laws were universal, not confined to one nation or faith. Still, the science of earthquakes advanced slowly. Without instruments to measure ground motion or detect seismic waves, theories remained speculative. Many clung to older notions, that earthquakes were caused by the ignition of underground gases or by the collapse of vast subterranean caverns. These ideas, while flawed, at least attempted to link cause and effect without invoking supernatural punishment. The Lisbon event thus functioned as a bridge between two worlds, one dominated by providential explanations, the other seeking mechanical, measurable causes. The cultural weight of the disaster also ensured that the scientific impulse could not be confined to scholars alone. Ordinary citizens, having witnessed the destruction, began to think differently about the earth beneath their feet. The notion that the ground was immutable, stable, and permanent had been shattered. People in Lisbon rebuilt their homes with new designs intended to resist future quakes, a form of applied science born directly from observation. Wooden lattice frameworks, known as Gaiola construction, were introduced to absorb seismic energy. This was one of the earliest recorded instances of earthquake-resistant engineering, and it arose not from abstract theory, but from lived experience, tested by fire and tremor. Indeed, Pombal's rebuilding program was itself a kind of social experiment. Streets were widened to reduce fire risk. Building heights were regulated. Materials were standardized. The city became, in effect, a laboratory for urban resilience. And while these measures could not prevent earthquakes, they reflected a crucial Enlightenment principle, that human reason could adapt to nature's challenges, even if it could not eliminate them. The scientific legacy of the 1755 earthquake did not yield immediate breakthroughs in seismology. Those would come much later, in the 19th and 20th centuries, but it seeded the idea that such study was possible and worthwhile. It demonstrated that catastrophe could be a source of knowledge, not merely destruction. And it revealed that the tools of observation and reason, when applied even in moments of chaos, could yield insights with lasting value. In this way, the Lisbon earthquake occupies a unique place in the history of science. It was both a tragedy and a teacher, stripping away the illusion of invulnerability and replacing it with a deeper curiosity about the planet we inhabit. The ruins of the city became, paradoxically, a foundation, not of stone, but of inquiry. From the ashes of churches and palaces rose not only new buildings, but a new way of thinking. That to understand nature's power, one must first observe it with clear eyes, record it without prejudice, and seek its patterns with humility. The great irony is that this transformation was, in part, an accident. Pombal's primary motive was practical governance, not pure science. Yet in striving to govern wisely, he had stumbled into a method that would echo through centuries of disaster response. The data his questionnaires gathered may have been imperfect, but the precedent they set was invaluable. From that point on, every earthquake of note in Europe was observed, compared, and, in some measure, understood in the light of Lisbon's example. Thus, the Lisbon earthquake stands not only as a monument to destruction, but also as a cornerstone in the architecture of human knowledge. It proved that in the midst of catastrophe, there is room for reason, that the shaking of the earth can also be the stirring of the mind, and that, in the Enlightenment's grand project to illuminate the world, even the darkest day could cast a light worth following. The shockwaves of the Lisbon earthquake did not stop at Portugal's borders. They rippled through Europe's salons, academies, and universities, colliding with the intellectual currents of the 18th century. The Enlightenment, already in motion as a cultural and philosophical movement, was suddenly confronted with an event that challenged its optimism, its rationalism, and its belief in human progress. For decades, European thinkers had been engaged in a confident project to understand the world through reason, to replace superstition with science, and to chart a future in which humanity, guided by knowledge, could master its destiny. The destruction of Lisbon on November 1st, 1755, was a blunt reminder that nature could still devastate without warning, reason, or mercy. Reports of the disaster spread rapidly. Ships carried the news across the Atlantic and up through Europe's great rivers. Newspapers published vivid accounts. Letters circulated among intellectual circles. The scale was unprecedented in living memory. Tens of thousands dead, a capital city in flames, the sea itself rising to swallow the shore. To a Europe accustomed to smaller, localized disasters, Lisbon's destruction was something else entirely, global in implication, almost apocalyptic in tone. And for the philosophes of the Enlightenment, it posed unsettling questions. If nature operated according to rational laws, How could such indiscriminate horror occur? If humanity's progress was inevitable, why could it be so suddenly erased? One of the first and most famous responses came from Voltaire, who saw in the earthquake a challenge to the optimistic philosophy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and his followers. Leibniz had argued that we live in the best of all possible worlds, a creation in which even apparent evils ultimately serve a greater good. This belief, known as philosophical optimism, had seeped into Enlightenment thought, harmonizing with the period's emphasis on order and reason. But Lisbon, in Voltaire's eyes, shattered that harmony. In his famous poem Sur le désastre de Lisbon, 1756, he mocked the idea that such suffering could be part of a divine plan. Will you say, seeing this mass of victims, that God is avenged, their death is the price of their crimes? For Voltaire, the earthquake proved that nature was indifferent to morality. The universe was not designed for our comfort, and no metaphysical optimism could soften the reality of its violence. This confrontation of ideas did not end with poetry. Voltaire embedded the philosophical fallout into his satirical novel Candide, 1759, in which the naive hero's belief in optimism is battered by a series of disasters, including a thinly veiled version of the Lisbon earthquake. In Candide, the quake becomes a literary instrument, a way to strip away illusions about the perfectibility of the world. It is no accident that the book's most famous refrain, "All is for the best in the best of all possible worlds," is made absurd precisely because of such tragedies. Yet not all Enlightenment thinkers saw the earthquake as evidence against reason. Some saw it as a call to deepen reason's application. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his letters to Voltaire, suggested that much of the catastrophe's human toll was not inevitable, but the result of urban density and poor construction. If Lisbon had been less crowded, if its houses had been less massive, if people had not gathered in vulnerable churches for All Saints' Day, the loss of life might have been reduced. Rousseau thus reframed the disaster as a problem of human planning, not cosmic injustice, a perspective that foreshadowed modern disaster science and urban safety measures. Meanwhile, in scientific circles, the Lisbon earthquake spurred one of the earliest systematic attempts to study a seismic event empirically. Under the direction of the Marquis of Pombal, detailed questionnaires were sent to parishes across Portugal and beyond, asking witnesses about the timing of the tremors, the direction of movements, the behavior of animals, the effects on wells and rivers. This was a remarkable break from purely theological interpretations. It sought patterns, data, and measurable facts. While the science of plate tectonics was still more than a century away, the Lisbon survey marked a step toward understanding earthquakes as natural phenomena rather than divine punishments. Theologians, of course, could not ignore the quake. Across Catholic Europe, sermons described Lisbon's fate as a warning against sin, echoing the language of the Book of Revelation. Protestant preachers in Britain and the Netherlands likewise interpreted the disaster as evidence of divine wrath, sometimes casting it as judgment upon a Catholic monarchy. But the very multiplicity of these interpretations, each tradition framing the event to suit its own doctrines, undermined their credibility in the eyes of the increasingly skeptical public. If the same disaster could be read as a punishment for Catholicism in Protestant sermons and as a punishment for Protestantism in Catholic sermons, perhaps it was punishment for nothing at all. This erosion of theological certainty gave space for secular philosophies to advance. The Lisbon earthquake became a case study in how Enlightenment Europe was renegotiating the relationship between faith and reason. For some, it reinforced a belief in a distant, non-interventionist deity, a God who had set the universe in motion but did not interfere with its mechanical operations. For others, it inspired outright atheism, the conviction that no divine hand shaped human fate. In the broader cultural sphere, Lisbon became a metaphor as well as an event. Poets, dramatists, and essayists invoked it to symbolize sudden, inexplicable ruin. The quake's imagery appeared in paintings and pamphlets, in operas and political tracts. It was used to critique tyranny, to lament human vulnerability, to argue for reform. Its resonance was so strong that, decades later, when the French Revolution unleashed its own chaos, some compared Paris in 1793 to Lisbon in 1755, a city consumed by forces beyond control. But perhaps the most enduring impact of the earthquake on Enlightenment thought was its challenge to the idea of progress. The Enlightenment's confidence rested on the assumption that human history was a steady climb toward improvement, guided by reason and science. Lisbon suggested that progress could be interrupted, violently, arbitrarily, and without warning. It was a humbling reminder that human achievements, however grand, were built on a fragile foundation. In this sense, the earthquake did not simply shake buildings. It shook the mental architecture of Europe. It forced philosophers to grapple with randomness, with the possibility that the universe might not be fully comprehensible, and with the limits of human control. Some responded by retreating into theological fatalism. Others doubled down on the Enlightenment project, arguing that the answer to catastrophe was not resignation but better knowledge, better planning, and better governance. The tension between these responses became one of the defining features of late Enlightenment thought. Lisbon was not forgotten. For years, the disaster was cited in debates about theodicy, science, and politics. It became a touchstone in the emerging fields of geology and seismology. And in the salons of Paris, the coffee houses of London, the academies of Berlin, the very name Lisbon evoked both awe and unease. A reminder that the earth itself could intervene in human affairs without warning, overturning the certainties of both faith and reason. The Enlightenment was not derailed by Lisbon, but it was tempered by it. The quake had revealed that reason's triumph was not guaranteed, that nature could still humble the most ambitious of civilizations. This recognition would echo in later centuries, in every scientific discipline that wrestled with the unpredictable. In the end, the Lisbon earthquake was not just a disaster for Portugal, it was a philosophical earthquake for Europe. It shook the continent's intellectual foundations, forcing a recalibration of its grandest ideals. And in doing so, it left a legacy as enduring as any building Pombal rebuilt in stone. In the aftermath of devastation, power often seeks form in those who can bring order to chaos. As the smoke rose from the ruins of Lisbon and cries of mourning echoed through broken alleyways, it was not divine providence nor philosophical inquiry that steadied the capital. It was a man, a singular, forceful, unsentimental figure, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later known as the Marquês de Pombal. In the wreckage of Lisbon, amid ash and anarchy, he would not only rebuild a city, but reforge a nation. The earthquake shattered stone, but it built his legend. Before November 1st, 1755, Carvalho e Melo had already carved a place within Portugal's political landscape. He was a diplomat by training, having served in Vienna and London, and a reform-minded minister who eyed the sluggish machinery of Portuguese governance with deep suspicion. Appointed Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and War in 1750 under King José I, he was neither universally admired nor widely feared. He was pragmatic, coldly efficient, and largely unromantic. But it was the catastrophe of Lisbon that transformed him from court functionary into architect of modern Portugal. As soon as word reached the royal court, temporarily stationed outside the city in Belém, that the capital was in ruins, King José was reportedly paralyzed with grief. Nobles wept. The clergy prayed. Many despaired. But Carvalho e Melo is said to have delivered his response with brutal clarity: bury the dead and feed the living. It was not a flourish of rhetoric. It was a directive, and it became the principle upon which the entire national recovery would be built. He entered Lisbon not as a mourner, but as a commander. The scale of the challenge before him was staggering. Tens of thousands dead. Entire neighborhoods obliterated. The port filled with sunken ships. Roads impassable. Food scarce. Fires still burning. In the face of this, Pombal moved with swift, authoritarian precision. His first actions were logistical. He ordered the immediate removal of corpses to prevent plague, using mass graves and even sea burials to dispose of the dead. Looters were dealt with harshly, some hanged on the spot. Food and water were rationed. Makeshift hospitals were erected. Then came the restructuring. Rather than merely clearing rubble, Pombal saw opportunity in disaster. Lisbon, long a city of twisting medieval streets and vulnerable wooden houses, could now be redesigned from the ground up. He summoned military engineers and architects and tasked them not with restoring the past, but imagining the future. Out of destruction would come a new Lisbon, symmetrical, rational, earthquake-resistant. It would be an Enlightenment city, built not on divine inspiration, but on geometry and governance. What followed was among the most ambitious urban redevelopment projects in European history. The Baixa district, one of the most devastated areas, was completely redesigned with wide boulevards, uniform neoclassical buildings, and innovative anti-seismic construction techniques. Buildings were tested using models suspended and shaken by troops marching in formation to simulate tremors. The Pombaline style, as it came to be known, was both architectural and ideological. It reflected not only aesthetic taste, but the assertion of state control over urban space. The new Lisbon would be modern, orderly, and, above all, governable. But Pombal's vision extended beyond stone and mortar. He saw in the quake a mandate to reform the entire apparatus of Portuguese society. The church, bloated with wealth and influence, had failed to protect the city. The nobility, comfortable in privilege, had offered no leadership. In contrast, it was the centralized state, his state, that had delivered security and stability. He seized the moment to curtail ecclesiastical power, reduce aristocratic autonomy, and expand royal authority. One of his most dramatic confrontations came with the Jesuit order, whose members had long dominated education and held deep sway over the populace. Pombal viewed them as enemies of reform, an empire within the empire. In the wake of the earthquake, as some Jesuits preached that the disaster was punishment for secular sins, Pombal saw an opportunity. He launched a campaign against them, accusing them of conspiracy, economic corruption, and political meddling. By 1759, he had expelled the Jesuits from Portugal entirely, a seismic shift of a different kind, one that echoed across Catholic Europe. Pombal also reformed education, replacing church-run schools with secular institutions that emphasized science, mathematics, and modern languages. He promoted industry, trade, and scientific exploration. He introduced new taxation systems and labor laws. He banned slavery within Portugal itself, though not in its colonies. These reforms were not uniformly benevolent, but they were sweeping. He was not a democrat. He was an enlightened autocrat. But in a time of crisis, his brand of authoritarian progressivism gained traction. Internationally, observers were astounded. In France, Enlightenment thinkers praised Pombal as a man of reason and resolve. In Britain, newspapers reported admiringly on Lisbon's rapid rebuilding. In a Europe still wrestling with how to manage the relationship between church and state, tradition and modernity, Pombal became a symbol of rational governance rising from the ashes of disaster. Yet his methods drew criticism. He ruled with an iron hand, silencing dissent, imprisoning rivals, and expanding a secret police network. His enemies accused him of cruelty, ambition, and even heresy. His most notorious crackdown came after an alleged assassination attempt on King José in 1758, known as the Tavora Affair. Pombal used it as a pretext to eliminate several noble families, executing members of the powerful Tavora clan and others in public displays meant to terrify opposition. To his critics, this was tyranny masked as reform. To his supporters, it was necessary purification. Pombal's reign of influence continued until King José's death in 1777. The new queen, Maria I, dismissed him almost immediately, loathing his cruelty and his secularism. He was exiled to his estates and died in semi-disgrace in 1782. But though his power waned, his legacy did not. The Lisbon he rebuilt stood as testament. The administrative systems he created endured. The philosophical shockwave he helped channel reshaped how Europe understood catastrophe, not as divine punishment, but as civic challenge. Indeed, what made Pombal's rise so significant was that he converted suffering into strategy. He did not ask why the earthquake happened. He asked what could be done next. In a time when many looked to heaven for answers, he looked to engineering. In an age still reverent of mysticism, he turned to mathematics. And in a nation that had been brought to its knees, he imposed order, often brutally, to ensure it would stand again. In doing so, he helped shift the European response to disaster from the theological to the logistical. His approach laid foundations not only for Lisbon's physical rebuilding, but for modern concepts of emergency response, urban planning, and state-led recovery. He was not beloved, but he was necessary. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of the earthquake's legacy, that in the face of overwhelming tragedy, it was not saints or philosophers who saved the city, but a man with a plan, a pen, and the will to act. Lisbon had cracked. Its churches had crumbled. Its bells had fallen silent. But in the silence, a new kind of authority had emerged. Unmoved by superstition, impatient with delay, and determined to bend calamity into opportunity. In Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, disaster had found its steward, and Europe, watching closely, would never look at earthquakes or governments the same way again. In the weeks after the earth shuddered beneath Lisbon, the air over the ruins was thick with dust, smoke, and the murmurs of speculation. Survivors searched for the living, for the bodies of the dead, for the scattered remnants of homes, but also for answers. For centuries, earthquakes had been explained almost exclusively in theological terms: divine wrath, supernatural omens, the subterranean movements of dragons or demons. But the devastation of Lisbon, occurring in a major European capital at the height of the Enlightenment, demanded an accounting that went beyond the pulpit. What had happened? Why had the ground rolled like the sea? Could it happen again? For perhaps the first time in recorded history, a government responded to such a disaster with something resembling a scientific investigation. This was no accident. At the center of Lisbon's recovery stood Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the future Marquis of Pombal, whose unshakable pragmatism had already begun to redefine the Portuguese state's relationship to knowledge. Pombal was no scientist, but he was a man of the Enlightenment, keenly aware that political stability rested on understanding and managing the natural world as much as on managing people. He recognized that the quake was not only a human tragedy, but a mystery to be solved. Within days, he ordered a remarkable survey, one that would mark a turning point in the study of earthquakes. Circulars were sent to every parish in Portugal and its overseas territories, containing a list of pointed, practical questions. Did the sea rise or fall before the first shock? How long did the shaking last? Which direction did buildings fall? Were there changes in springs or wells? Did animals behave strangely beforehand? These questions, simple yet revolutionary, treated the earthquake as a phenomenon to be observed and measured rather than a purely supernatural event. The responses poured in over the following months, offering a patchwork of observations from fishermen on the Algarve coast, priests in the Miho countryside, merchants in Madeira, and soldiers in Brazil. Some were poetic and imprecise, others meticulous and data-rich, but together they formed one of the earliest systematic datasets on a seismic event. The exercise was unprecedented. For the first time, a European government had sought to understand an earthquake not to divine its meaning, but to uncover its mechanism. This survey revealed patterns that hinted at underlying geophysical truths. Accounts from the Azores and Madeira described tremors before the main shock, suggesting foreshocks. Reports from coastal towns confirmed the rapid retreat and violent return of the sea, a classic signature of what we now call a tsunami. Inland witnesses spoke of rumbling noises preceding the shaking, while shepherds in the mountains noted landslides and fissures that had not existed before. Though the scientific vocabulary to explain these things did not yet exist, the data pointed toward the interconnectedness of seismic events and coastal flooding. In this way, the Lisbon earthquake became a laboratory of the Enlightenment. Philosophers and naturalists across Europe pored over the reports, comparing them with accounts of earlier quakes in Calabria, Constantinople, and Peru. Though no one yet spoke of tectonic plates, there was a growing sense that earthquakes might arise from deep natural processes, movements within the Earth's crust, perhaps, or the sudden release of subterranean vapors and heat. Some thinkers clung to older notions. The ancient idea that underground caverns filled with air or water could collapse under their own weight remained popular, as did the theory that volcanic activity, even far from active volcanoes, could cause tremors. Yet the Lisbon investigation pushed the discussion toward a more empirical footing. Instead of assuming causes from first principles, investigators began with observed effects and worked backward. The scientific reverberations of Lisbon extended far beyond geology. Physicians examined the health impacts of prolonged exposure to dust and ash, Architects studied which types of structures had resisted the shaking best. Engineers proposed new methods of construction, including flexible wooden frames and lighter materials. In the field of what would later be called disaster management, Lisbon became a case study in the relationship between human settlement patterns and vulnerability to natural hazards. In Britain, the Royal Society took a keen interest, not least because English merchants had suffered heavy losses in the quake and the ensuing fires. Papers were read in London comparing Lisbon's destruction with earthquakes in Jamaica and the American colonies, hinting at the possibility that seismic activity might follow predictable patterns in certain regions. In France, the Academy of Sciences began compiling an inventory of past earthquakes, seeking commonalities. Even in Russia, far from the tremors, scholars debated whether seismicity might be linked to planetary alignments or lunar cycles, ideas we now dismiss, but which marked a sincere attempt to find order in apparent chaos. The Lisbon Survey also set a precedent for the role of the state in scientific inquiry. Until then, most scientific investigations were the work of individuals or small societies. Here, for the first time, a centralized government had acted as a coordinator, collector, and curator of data on a massive scale. In doing so, it implicitly acknowledged that understanding natural phenomena was part of governance, that public safety and prosperity depended not only on laws and armies, but on knowledge. The earthquake's role in shaping the nascent science of seismology cannot be overstated. While true modern seismology would not emerge until the 19th century, Lisbon's 1755 catastrophe created an intellectual framework for it. It demonstrated that earthquakes could be studied systematically, that data could be gathered from diverse witnesses, and that patterns could be teased from apparent randomness. It also hinted at the global nature of such phenomena. The tsunami triggered by the quake was observed not only on Portugal's shores, but in Cornwall, the Caribbean, and even as far as Brazil, underscoring the interconnectedness of Earth's systems. Of course, the Enlightenment was not without its blind spots. While Pombel's survey was rigorous for its time, it was also incomplete. Many of the most vulnerable communities, enslaved Africans in Brazil, indigenous peoples in the colonies, the urban poor of Lisbon's Alfama district, were underrepresented in the responses. Their experiences were filtered through the accounts of priests, officials, or landowners, often stripped of detail or colored by prejudice. The science of the day was still embedded in the hierarchies and exclusions of the society that produced it. Nevertheless, the Lisbon investigation planted seeds that would grow into disciplines we now take for granted. It showed that a natural disaster could be something more than an act of God. It could be an object of study, a puzzle to be solved. And it proved that such study was not an idle pursuit. The knowledge gleaned could save lives, if only by inspiring better preparation and more resilient construction. In a broader sense, Lisbon's scientific awakening was part of a cultural shift. Across Europe, the quake fueled debates not only about geology, but about the nature of human progress. Could knowledge truly protect humanity from nature's fury? Or would our growing mastery of the physical world always be checked by forces beyond our control? The Lisbon earthquake did not answer these questions, but it reframed them in ways that would shape the next century of scientific and political thought. By the end of the decade, copies of Pombel's survey and the reports it generated were circulating in libraries from Edinburgh to Naples. In these pages lay the beginnings of a new relationship between humanity and the earth, one in which observation, reason, and collective effort would gradually replace superstition as the first tools we reached for when the ground began to shake. The tremors had long since ceased, but the intellectual aftershocks would reverberate for generations, carrying Lisbon's tragedy into the birth of a science. When the smoke had thinned and the last embers cooled, Lisbon lay like a broken chessboard, pieces scattered, its grid erased. Streets that had once twisted in the medieval fashion, tangled and intimate, were buried under ash and fractured stone. Landmarks by which generations had oriented themselves, the Grand Ribera Palace, the bustling quays of the Tagus, the labyrinthine alleys of Baixa, were gone, reduced to charred outlines on scorched earth. In the wake of the earthquake, the city's ruin was not just physical. It was an erasure of memory, a wound to the collective identity of Portugal. For Sebastio José de Carvalho y Melo, the future Marquis of Pombal, the destruction was both tragedy and opportunity. As minister of the kingdom, he understood that Lisbon could not simply be patched together. It needed to be remade. His vision was not nostalgia for what had been lost, but a projection of what could be built. A city that would reflect Enlightenment ideals of order, utility, and reason. This was not merely a matter of aesthetics. For Pombal, the reconstruction of Lisbon was a demonstration of state power and modernity, a declaration that Portugal would not retreat into medieval vulnerability, but stride forward into a new age. From the beginning, his approach was uncompromising. When some advisors suggested rebuilding in the same location, but preserving remnants of the old street patterns, Pombal reportedly dismissed the idea. The disaster had exposed the dangers of cramped streets and irregular plots. They had trapped fire, hindered escape, and amplified chaos. In their place, Pombal envisioned a rational grid of wide, straight avenues that would permit both efficient movement and military control. The new city would be airy and symmetrical, designed to facilitate trade, communication, and defense. To achieve this, he assembled a team of military engineers, architects, and surveyors, among them Manuel de Maya, Eugenio dos Santos, and Carlos Mardel. Their first task was to map the ruin, a delicate undertaking, for much of Lisbon was still dangerous to navigate. Walls leaned precariously, fissures gaped in the streets, and the smell of decay hung over the rubble. Yet within months, they had drawn up plans for what would become known as the Baixa Pombalina, a district reborn with mathematical precision. The new Baixa was conceived as a perfect grid. Streets would run parallel and perpendicular to the Tagus River, each broad enough to allow carts and troops to pass easily, each oriented to maximize air circulation and sunlight. At the heart of this plan were grand public squares, Praça do Comércio, Praça Dom Pedro IV, and others, intended as stages for civic life and symbols of royal authority. The Praça do Comércio, occupying the site of the destroyed Ribeira Palace, would open directly onto the river, a vast ceremonial space framed by arcaded buildings that spoke of both imperial ambition and commercial vitality. Yet perhaps the most forward-thinking element of the reconstruction was not visible in the plan's geometry, but in its engineering. Lisbon's builders faced a problem: how to erect structures that could withstand the violent tremors that had so recently leveled the city. The solution was the Gaiola Pombalina, the Pombaline cage, a flexible wooden framework embedded within masonry walls. This lattice of interlocking timber acted as a shock absorber, distributing seismic forces and reducing the likelihood of collapse. It was an innovation ahead of its time, one of the earliest known examples of anti-seismic construction in the modern world. Pombal's insistence on this system was more than theoretical. According to accounts, prototypes of the Gaiola were tested by having soldiers march in unison around them, their synchronized steps mimicking the vibrations of an earthquake. If the structure held, it was approved for construction. This combination of empirical testing and standardized design reflected the Enlightenment's faith in reason and experimentation, a faith that, in Lisbon's case, was wedded to authoritarian resolve. Indeed, Pombal's reconstruction was as much about social order as physical rebuilding. Property rights were reassessed, plots were resized to fit the new grid, sometimes against the wishes of owners. Building heights were regulated, facades standardized, and materials prescribed. These measures ensured aesthetic harmony and structural safety, but they also asserted the dominance of the central authority over private interest. The new Lisbon would not grow haphazardly. It would be shaped by the will of the state. This rigidity extended to labor. The earthquake had left thousands homeless, many of whom had fled to the countryside or to Portugal's colonies. Pombal ordered their return, threatening punishment for those who refused to assist in the rebuilding. Workers were conscripted, supplies requisitioned, and prices controlled to prevent profiteering. While these measures accelerated reconstruction, they also deepened resentment among certain segments of society, particularly the aristocracy, whose privileges Pombal curtailed, and the church, whose influence he sought to diminish. Yet the results were undeniable. Within a decade, much of the Baixa had been rebuilt, its streets alive once more with merchants, craftsmen, and sailors. Ships unloaded goods from Brazil, Angola, and Goa at the new quays. Warehouses brimmed with spices, sugar, and gold. Cafes and inns bustled with traders speaking a dozen tongues. Lisbon had re-emerged not as a replica of its former self, but as a new kind of city. Rational, resilient, and unmistakably modern. Still, the transformation was not without loss. The medieval city, with its tangled alleys and intimate courtyards, was gone. In its place stood a disciplined geometry that some found soulless, stripped of the organic complexity that had given Lisbon its old-world charm. The past had been sacrificed to the future, and while this sacrifice was necessary for survival, it left a sense of cultural dislocation that would linger for generations. Beyond architecture, the rebuilding of Lisbon became a model for disaster recovery worldwide. Other cities studied its anti-seismic techniques, its urban planning principles, and its centralized management. From Naples to Lima, officials sought to apply Lisbon's lessons, though few could match the scale or speed of Pombal's reforms. The idea that a city could emerge from catastrophe stronger than before, that destruction could be a catalyst for modernization, became part of the Enlightenment narrative of progress. Yet there was also a more subtle legacy. The new Lisbon embodied a philosophical shift, the belief that humanity could not only adapt to nature's power, but anticipate and mitigate it. This was a departure from the fatalism that had dominated for centuries. By imposing order on the ruins, Pombal and his engineers sent a message. The city's destiny would be determined not by divine whim, but by human design. In the years that followed, Lisbon's transformation would be celebrated in art, literature, and political discourse. Engravings of the Bikes' symmetrical streets circulated across Europe. Travelers marveled at the grandeur of Praça do Comércio and the elegance of the arcades. Diplomats wrote home of a city reborn, a phoenix risen from ashes. Yet beneath the triumphal narrative lay the memory of the morning when the ground had opened, the sea had risen, and fire had devoured all in between. The grid, the squares, the gaiola. All were, in a sense, monuments to absence, memorials to a Lisbon that could not be rebuilt. In this way, the rebuilt capital was both a triumph and a memorial, a living testament to resilience and a reminder of fragility. The streets might be straight and the buildings strong, but beneath them lay the same restless earth. The Enlightenment had given Lisbon the tools to resist destruction, but not to banish it. The city's new face was confident, even defiant, but in the quiet moments, at night, when the wind carried the scent of the Tagus through the arcades, it still listened for the deep, distant rumble that had once changed everything. The Lisbon earthquake did more than topple buildings and sink ships. It cracked the intellectual foundations of Europe. While the physical reconstruction under Pombal was a triumph of engineering and governance, the moral and spiritual reconstruction of the continent was far more turbulent. In pulpits, salons, universities, and pamphlets, thinkers struggled to reconcile the devastation with their understanding of divine justice, natural law, and human destiny. For centuries, earthquakes and other disasters had been interpreted as acts of God, punishments for sin, warnings to the wicked, or tests of faith. Such views were embedded not just in religious teaching, but in the very vocabulary of disaster. Yet Lisbon in 1755 posed a singular challenge to this framework. The catastrophe had struck on All Saints' Day, a holy day when the faithful thronged churches across the city. Thousands died not in dens of vice, but in houses of worship. The irony was devastating. Why would a just and benevolent God choose this moment, this place, to unleash such horror? Theologians were quick to respond, but their answers were no longer universally accepted. Some, like the Jesuits, clung to traditional explanations, arguing that Lisbon had become morally lax, its wealth from empire breeding arrogance and indulgence. In their sermons, the earthquake was divine retribution, a call to repentance. Others, however, found this reasoning not only unsatisfying but morally repugnant. If God punished sinners so indiscriminately, killing the pious alongside the impious, what kind of justice was that? It was here that Enlightenment philosophy confronted the old theological order. Across Europe, leading intellectuals took up their pens. Voltaire, the French philosophe, famously skewered the idea of divine benevolence in his poem Sur le désastre de Lisbon, and later in Candide. He mocked the optimistic philosophy of Leibniz, that we live in the best of all possible worlds, by juxtaposing it with the brutal reality of Lisbon's suffering. For Voltaire, the earthquake was proof that nature was indifferent to human morality, that evil and suffering were part of existence without divine design or cosmic purpose. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, while disagreeing with Voltaire's outright dismissal of providence, also rejected the easy fatalism of religious orthodoxy. In his letters, Rousseau argued that the scale of the tragedy was exacerbated by human choices, the concentration of population in dense urban spaces, the construction of tall stone buildings prone to collapse. In this, he anticipated a more modern understanding of disaster, that it is as much a social and political phenomenon as a natural one. These debates spilled beyond the circles of philosophers into the broader public. The printing press, by the mid-18th century, was a force capable of spreading ideas with unprecedented speed. Reports of the earthquake, eyewitness accounts, death tolls, lists of destroyed churches and palaces circulated widely. Alongside them appeared theological tracts, satirical pamphlets, and philosophical essays. In coffee houses from London to Berlin, people discussed not only the engineering marvels of Lisbon's reconstruction, but the unsettling questions the disaster raised about the nature of the world and humanity's place in it. In Portugal itself, the official response to these debates was shaped by Pombal's pragmatism. He had little patience for theological speculation that distracted from the work of rebuilding. The Jesuits, who had been among the most vocal in framing the earthquake as divine punishment, found themselves increasingly at odds with his secularizing agenda. Within a decade, their influence in Portugal would be crushed, culminating in their expulsion in 1759, an act justified in part by their resistance to the Enlightenment reforms Pombal championed. But Pombal's secularism did not eliminate religious interpretation among the people. In rural Portugal, processions and penitential rites continued for years after the quake. Priests told tales of miraculous survivals and saintly interventions, weaving the disaster into local folklore. In some villages, survivors of the tsunami swore they had seen visions in the waves, angels, the Virgin Mary, or spectral warnings. Such stories resisted the rationalist current, preserving a worldview in which divine agency still shaped the human story. Beyond Europe, the earthquake reverberated through the Catholic world. In Brazil, the news shook both colonists and clergy. If God's wrath could fall on Lisbon, the heart of the empire, what did that mean for the colonies? In Spanish America, preachers used the disaster as a moral lesson, warning their congregations to remain pious lest similar punishment befall them. In Asia, Jesuit missionaries used the earthquake as an example of God's power when teaching in China and India, though they faced the challenge of explaining why this power had been directed at one of Europe's most devout capitals. Yet for the Enlightenment, Lisbon became a symbol of the need to disentangle natural phenomena from moral judgments. The emerging science of seismology took root in the quake's aftermath. Pombal himself commissioned a questionnaire to be sent to every parish in Portugal, asking detailed questions. Did the sea rise or fall first? How long did the shaking last? Did animals behave strangely beforehand? This was perhaps the first systematic, scientific survey of an earthquake in history. The data it produced not only informed reconstruction, but laid groundwork for understanding seismic activity as a natural process, not an act of divine will. The philosophical impact of Lisbon extended even to those who had never set foot in the city. In Germany, Immanuel Kant, then a young scholar, was fascinated by the reports. He wrote 3 treatises on earthquakes, attempting to explain them through natural causes such as subterranean gases and shifting masses within the earth. Though his theories were imperfect, his approach marked a decisive turn towards scientific explanation over theological reasoning. Over time, Lisbon became a touchstone in the Enlightenment's larger project, to replace superstition with reason, arbitrary authority with evidence-based governance, and blind faith with informed inquiry. The disaster was cited in debates on everything from urban planning to theodicy, from colonial policy to human rights. If suffering could be understood and mitigated by human action, then it followed that humanity had a duty to act. not to wait for divine intervention. Still, this shift was uneven and incomplete. In the decades that followed, Europe would experience other disasters. The eruption of Vesuvius in 1794, floods along the Danube, famines in Ireland and France, and each would reignite the tension between theological interpretation and scientific understanding. Yet Lisbon remained unique in its scale, its timing, and its role as a crucible for modern thought. By the close of the 18th century, the earthquake had acquired a dual legacy. For theologians, it remained a cautionary tale about divine mystery and human fragility. For philosophers and scientists, it was a case study in the necessity of rational inquiry and the potential for progress in the face of catastrophe. For the people of Lisbon, it was both, a scar on the city's memory and a foundation for its rebirth. The rebuilt Baixa, with its orderly streets and earthquake-resistant buildings, stood as a physical testament to the Enlightenment's promise that reason, discipline, and innovation could tame even the most chaotic forces of nature. Yet in the minds of many, the tremors had not ceased. They echoed in questions that refused to be fully answered. Why here? Why then? Why so many? These questions bridged theology and philosophy, faith and reason, leaving Lisbon not just as a city reborn, but as a permanent riddle in the history of human thought. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 did not exist in isolation. Though its tremors were felt physically only within a limited geographical range, its intellectual and political aftershocks radiated across decades, subtly influencing the great transformations that would convulse the Atlantic world in the latter half of the 18th century. The reconstruction of Lisbon under Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, later the Marquis of Pombal, became a symbol of enlightened governance. His methods, swift centralization of authority, reliance on scientific observation, and bold social reform, offered a template and a warning to other nations on the brink of change. When Pombal began rebuilding, he did more than order the design of earthquake-resistant architecture. He imposed sweeping economic measures, broke the stranglehold of entrenched guilds, reorganized colonial trade, and asserted the power of the state over the church. In doing so, he aligned Lisbon's rebirth with the broader intellectual currents of the Enlightenment. Yet these same reforms, decisive, rational, often ruthless, were precisely the kinds of centralized authority that revolutionary movements later sought to challenge. Lisbon thus embodied a paradox. It demonstrated the transformative potential of strong leadership while also planting the seeds of skepticism toward absolute power. Across Europe, observers drew their own lessons. In France, philosophers looked to Lisbon as proof that human reason could overcome catastrophe, but also as a reminder that such reason could be monopolized by the few. In Britain, newspapers praised the speed of the recovery, even as political commentators debated whether such efficiency could be achieved without infringing on traditional liberties. The British experience with the 7 Years' War in the American colonies would soon provide an arena for testing those questions. The earthquake's philosophical shockwave continued to inform political thought. The destruction of a city on a holy day, the drowning of thousands in the tsunami, the collapse of ornate palaces and humble homes alike. All these images became metaphors for the fragility of established orders. Political radicals seized on them. If the natural world could level the rich and poor alike, why not society itself? The idea that entrenched hierarchies might be swept away overnight resonated with the growing dissatisfaction of the era. The transatlantic world was particularly susceptible to these currents. In the American colonies, the generation that would go on to lead the revolution grew up in an intellectual climate shaped by Enlightenment ideals, many of which were sharpened in the crucible of Lisbon's aftermath. Benjamin Franklin, already a man of science and diplomacy by the time of the earthquake, corresponded with European savants about the event. For Franklin, the quake was not an act of divine wrath, but a phenomenon to be studied and understood, an approach that mirrored the rationalism underpinning the American political experiment. In Brazil, Portugal's most valuable colony, the earthquake and Pombal's reforms had profound repercussions. The Crown's need to finance reconstruction led to increased pressure on colonial revenues, particularly from gold mining in Minas Gerais. These economic demands, coupled with Pombal's secularizing policies and his reduction of the Jesuits' influence, contributed to simmering tensions between colonial elites and the metropole. Though Brazil's own independence would not come until 1822, the intellectual and administrative shifts after 1755 prepared the ground for later movements. Lisbon's reconstruction also influenced urban planning in other colonial contexts. In Havana, Mexico City, and Rio de Janeiro, city officials studied Pombal's grid system and anti-seismic architecture. The idea that cities could be designed for resilience, planned to withstand future disasters, was radical for the 18th century, and it hinted at a new relationship between human society and the natural environment. Meanwhile, in Europe, the political climate darkened. The American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789 both drew, in different ways, from the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, rights, and reform, values that Lisbon's recovery had dramatized. Yet the French Revolution, in particular, also echoed the moral and metaphysical debates that the earthquake had intensified. The destruction of the Ancien regime in France was as much an intellectual event as it was political and military, and Lisbon had been an early battlefield in the war of ideas over authority, morality, and progress. The symbolism of the earthquake did not fade. In revolutionary rhetoric, Lisbon was sometimes invoked alongside Pompeii and biblical catastrophes. A reminder that sudden, transformative change could arrive without warning. For radicals, it was a call to action. If nature could destroy in moments what humans had built over centuries, then humans could likewise sweep away unjust systems. For conservatives, the earthquake served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of upheaval and the fragility of social order. In Portugal itself, Pombal's dominance waned after the death of King Joseph I in 1777. The Queen, Maria I, dismissed him, reversing some of his more authoritarian measures. Yet the physical and administrative legacy of his rule endured. Lisbon remained a city of Enlightenment ideals, rationally planned, structurally fortified, and administratively centralized. These qualities would influence Portuguese governance well into the 19th century, shaping the country's cautious navigation through the revolutionary storms of the age. Beyond politics, Lisbon's rebirth had cultural ramifications. Artists, poets, and musicians across Europe and the Americas grappled with the imagery of destruction and renewal. In the salons of Paris, Lisbon became a shorthand for the confrontation between human ambition and nature's indifference. In the opera houses of Italy, librettos hinted at the city's fall and resurrection, blending romantic tragedy with Enlightenment optimism. In the universities of Scotland, the disaster was studied as a case in natural philosophy, part of the Scottish Enlightenment's drive to reconcile empirical science with moral philosophy. The Age of Revolutions was not solely about political regimes. It was about the reordering of thought. Lisbon's earthquake had, decades earlier, forced Europeans to consider the limits of divine providence, the power of human agency, and the role of reason in public life. These questions underpinned the revolutions in America, France, Haiti, and beyond. In Haiti, for instance, the enslaved population's uprising in 1791 drew on the radical egalitarianism circulating in revolutionary discourse, a discourse whose genealogy could be traced, in part, to the skepticism and critical inquiry sparked by Lisbon's devastation. By the dawn of the 19th century, Lisbon had been rebuilt for over 40 years, yet the philosophical tremors of 1755 still resonated. The Baixa district's broad, symmetrical streets stood as a monument to the possibility of deliberate, rational reconstruction in the wake of chaos. The city's survival story was a reminder that catastrophe could be not only an ending but a beginning, a theme that resonated deeply with revolutionaries seeking to dismantle old orders and construct new ones. The Lisbon earthquake, then, was not merely a Portuguese tragedy. It was a global event in its intellectual consequences, feeding into the Enlightenment's rise and the revolutionary fervor that followed. It demonstrated both the necessity and the peril of decisive leadership, both the promise and the challenge of rational planning, and both the resilience and vulnerability of human societies. In the tapestry of the Age of Revolutions, Lisbon was a thread woven not through battles and treaties, but through ideas, debates, and the enduring question of how humanity should face the unpredictable forces, natural and political, that shape its destiny. By the opening decades of the 19th century, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 had already receded from immediate memory for most of Europe, overshadowed by the Napoleonic Wars, the reshaping of empires, and the spread of industrialization. Yet in Portugal, the event remained a living presence, embedded in the city's physical form, in the architecture of its central districts, and in the collective psychology of its people. The Baixa Pombalina, named after the Marquis of Pombal, was no longer simply a reconstruction. It had become the permanent face of Lisbon, a reminder of what had been destroyed and what had been rebuilt. The earthquake story was passed down in two ways: through the tangible, visible geometry of the rebuilt city and through the intangible inheritance of narratives, sermons, scientific treatises, and works of art inspired by the disaster. Every broad avenue, every earthquake-resistant building with its wooden latticework frame concealed within the masonry, spoke to a moment when the city's survival had hung in the balance. In this way, Lisbon itself became a living archive, each street a page in the history of human resilience. Yet memory is never static. In the early 19th century, the earthquake was remembered differently by different generations. For the elderly who had been children during the catastrophe, the memory was sensory. The sound of collapsing churches, the choking dust, the disorienting surge of the tsunami. For their children, born in the aftermath, it was a moral lesson, shaped by the rhetoric of the Enlightenment and the authoritarian efficiency of Pombal's reconstruction. For the youngest generations of the 19th century, it became almost mythic, a story of divine trial and human ingenuity, stripped of some of the terror but none of the symbolic weight. As Europe moved deeper into the age of industrial modernity, Lisbon's recovery began to be interpreted through new lenses. Engineers from Britain and France visited the city to study the Pombaline cage, the wooden framework inside buildings that allowed them to sway and absorb seismic shocks. Urban planners examined the city's grid layout as a precedent for fire breaks, sanitation, and traffic flow in growing metropolises. Lisbon, which had once been studied for its ruin, was now studied for its resilience. The intellectual legacy of the earthquake evolved as well. In the 18th century, the disaster had prompted debates about theodicy, divine justice, and the limits of human reason. By the 19th century, these questions were reframed in secular terms, aligning with the rise of geological science and the decline of literalist religious explanations for natural events. Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology and other works in the new science of deep time owed much to the empirical spirit that the Lisbon earthquake had helped to foster. The event was cited in early seismological studies, its scale and documentation making it a reference point for understanding seismic risk long before plate tectonics was understood. But Lisbon's memory of 1755 was not confined to science and engineering. It also had a cultural life. Romantic poets, fascinated by the sublime, the aesthetic of awe and terror, found in the earthquake an emblem of nature's overwhelming force. Painters captured apocalyptic visions of the city in flames or swallowed by the sea, while novelists used the disaster as a backdrop for personal dramas and moral allegories. In the arts, the earthquake retained its double identity, as a human tragedy and as a spectacle of the natural world's indifference. This duality became central to Lisbon's identity. The city was both ancient and modern, wounded and reborn. Tourists in the 19th century walked its orderly boulevards, often unaware that beneath their feet lay the debris of the old medieval city, entombed under layers of reconstruction. For Lisbon's residents, however, the earthquake was never entirely past. Earth tremors elsewhere in Europe and the Mediterranean periodically revived memories, sparking public discussions about preparedness and the fragility of urban life. Politically, the legacy of Pombal's reconstruction also persisted. His model of centralized, technocratic governance influenced not only Portuguese politics, but also the broader European approach to disaster management. Even in an era when liberal constitutionalism was challenging absolute rule, the memory of how swiftly and decisively Lisbon had been rebuilt offered a case study in the potential benefits of concentrated authority, tempered, in theory, by the safeguards of modern governance. Yet modernity also brought challenges to this legacy. Industrialization and population growth placed new strains on Lisbon's infrastructure. While the Baixa remained structurally sound, newer districts lacked the same seismic resilience. As railways connected the city more closely to the rest of Europe, Lisbon's vulnerability to economic and political shocks beyond its borders increased. In this sense, the earthquake's lesson, that resilience must be continually renewed, was as relevant in the 19th century as it had been in 1755. Memory, however, can fade or be reshaped to fit the needs of the present. By the late 19th century, the Lisbon earthquake was sometimes romanticized in popular histories, its human suffering softened by the passing of time. In schoolbooks, it became a story of national heroism and progress, emphasizing Pombal's leadership and the city's rebirth while downplaying the chaos, fear, and loss. This selective remembering reflected a broader 19th century tendency to frame past disasters as milestones on a march toward inevitable progress, a narrative that would itself be challenged in the 20th century. Still, for Lisbon, the earthquake remained a touchstone. In times of crisis, politicians invoked it as proof that the nation could endure and rebuild. In times of peace, architects and historians pointed to the Baixa as an example of harmony between function and beauty, resilience and elegance. The disaster had, paradoxically, given Lisbon a second birth, one that was as much about identity as it was about infrastructure. As the century drew to a close, new technologies, photography, telegraphy, mechanized printing, began to alter how disasters were reported and remembered. Future earthquakes would be captured in images and transmitted in near real time, their horrors and heroics unfolding in newspapers and illustrated magazines. Yet Lisbon's 1755 catastrophe, existing in the era before such media, remained dependent on the written word, the painted canvas, and the spoken story. This lent it a different kind of permanence, one rooted in interpretation as much as in fact. In this way, Lisbon entered modernity not simply as a survivor of the past, but as a custodian of it. The city's very form was an argument that the memory of disaster can be preserved not only in archives and monuments, but in the everyday spaces where people live, work, and gather. Walking through the Baixa in the 1890s, one could see shopkeepers opening shutters on the same facades designed in Pombal's time, children playing in squares laid out according to his plan, carriages rolling down streets engineered to allow both commerce and evacuation. The rhythms of daily life were themselves a testament to the success of that reconstruction. The Lisbon earthquake's journey from calamity to symbol was, by the dawn of the 20th century, largely complete. It had transformed from a moment of existential dread into a foundational chapter of Portuguese national identity, from a theological and philosophical riddle into a case study in resilience, from a European tragedy into a global lesson. Yet it was also a reminder that modernity, with all its innovations, could not eliminate vulnerability, only manage it. The lesson of 1755, if fully understood, was not that catastrophe could be prevented, but that it could be met with courage, reason, and the determination to rebuild. In this way, Lisbon carried the memory of its disaster into the modern age, not as a burden, but as a compass, guiding the city through the uncertainties of a changing world. Standing in Lisbon today, it is difficult to imagine the city as it was in the shattered days after November 1st, 1755. The streets of the Baixa bustle with the noise of commerce, cafes spill onto the sidewalks, and the Tagus glitters under the same sun that once revealed mountains of debris and tens of thousands of bodies. Tourists take photographs in Praça do Comércio, often unaware that they are standing on ground once churned by fire and flooded by the sea. The catastrophe that obliterated the city is, for most, a distant echo, yet in its time, it shook the very foundations of European thought. The Lisbon earthquake was more than an event. It was a hinge in the cultural and intellectual history of the West. It collapsed more than buildings. It cracked the confidence of an age. The Enlightenment had been gathering momentum, propelled by reason, optimism, and the belief in an orderly universe guided by rational laws. The earthquake exposed the fragility of that vision. How could a benevolent and rational order coexist with such indiscriminate devastation? Philosophers, scientists, theologians, and statesmen wrestled with this question, and their answers shaped the trajectory of modern Europe. In the religious sphere, the disaster spurred both fervent piety and radical doubt. Some clung to the interpretation of the earthquake as divine punishment, using it as a rallying cry for repentance. Others, like Voltaire, saw it as proof of the absurdity of claiming that this was the best of all possible worlds. His Candide sharpened the earthquake into a satirical blade, cutting through complacent optimism and demanding a harder reckoning with the problem of evil. In this debate, Lisbon became more than a city. It became a metaphor for the human condition. In science, the earthquake catalyzed the systematic study of seismic events. Reports of ground fissures, tidal waves, and aftershocks were gathered and compared, foreshadowing the disciplines of seismology and geology. Pomble's insistence on collecting eyewitness accounts, asking questions about the sequence of shocks, the direction of waves, the behavior of animals, was revolutionary in its method. It marked one of the first large-scale applications of empirical investigation to a natural disaster, embedding in European thought the idea that understanding could replace superstition. Politically, Lisbon's reconstruction became an enduring case study in crisis governance. The Marquis of Pombal's decisive, centralized control, organizing rescue, preventing looting, and launching a massive urban redesign, demonstrated that even in the face of overwhelming loss, swift, coordinated action could chart a path forward. Yet it also sparked debate about the limits of authority and the tension between order and liberty in moments of national emergency, a conversation that continues in disaster policy today. Culturally, the Lisbon earthquake transformed the European imagination. It infused art, literature, and philosophy with a heightened awareness of nature's power and humanity's vulnerability. Painters rendered apocalyptic skies and collapsing domes. Poets grappled with the terror and awe of the sublime. The disaster entered the canon of shared European memory alongside Vesuvius and the Great Fire of London, but with a difference. It arrived in the age of print, Enlightenment debate, and burgeoning global networks. News of Lisbon's ruins circled the world in weeks, not years, making it perhaps the first truly global disaster in the modern sense. The earthquake's greatest legacy, however, lies in the lesson it offered about resilience. Not the naive belief that destruction could be avoided, but the clear-eyed understanding that survival depends on adaptation. Lisbon's rebirth, from ashes and seawater to the orderly grid of the Baixa Pombalina, embodied a refusal to surrender to despair. It showed that tragedy can be a forge for progress, that grief can coexist with innovation, and that memory, if preserved with honesty, can be a foundation for the future. In a way, the Lisbon earthquake is not over. Its tremors still run through the modern world, in the ways cities are built, in the questions we ask about suffering and justice, in the strategies we adopt for resilience. It reminds us that beneath the stability of our streets lies the restless earth, and beneath the certainties of our philosophies lies the unpredictability of life. The ground can shift at any moment. The challenge is not to pretend otherwise, but to build with that knowledge in mind. And so, when the earth does tremble again, whether in stone, in society, or in the convictions we hold, we might remember Lisbon, a city that faced the unthinkable and learned not only to stand again, but to stand differently. Its story belongs not just to Portugal, nor just to Europe, but to all who must navigate the uncertain terrain of a world that is beautiful, dangerous, and forever in motion.